The Texas heat pressed down like a heavy quilt, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the cracked driveway and forces every breath to feel like fire. Cicadas sang their endless chorus from the pecan trees out back, and the dry wind rattled the old screen door as if it, too, wanted to leave. That's when his words cut through the stillness like a blade. "You're too old for me now." They didn't echo, they landed, sharp and final, as though he had rehearsed them in silence long before saying them aloud. Her fingers instinctively went to the thin band of gold around her hand, the wedding ring that had long since molded to the shape of her finger. She twisted it slightly, and in that small motion came a flood of memory, how he had slipped it on her hand under the dim light of a county courthouse, whispering promises too young and too bold to be doubted. That ring wasn't just metal, it was the weight of decades, the quiet proof of every morning she woke before dawn to iron his shirts, every night she stayed up mending tears not just in fabric, but in fortune, hope, and health. I didn't cry that day, she thought. I had already shed enough tears in this house. Instead, I remembered the nights I worked my fingers raw so he could stand tall, the mornings I carried the house alone while he dreamed. I thought of the sacrifices that didn't show in photographs, the years I stitched him back together when the world tried to break him. And then, unbidden, came a flash of their younger years, their rusty old pickup rattling down a Texas back road, windows rolled down because the air conditioner hadn't worked in years. They laughed as dust billowed behind them, talking of land they would buy, a home they would build, children they hadn't yet met but already loved in their minds. He squeezed her hand on the gear shift, and the future seemed wide open. Back then, age was not a curse. It was a road they would walk together. Now, decades later, that same hand, lined, veined, still strong, was being dismissed with a sentence that shrank her life into a number. Too old. As though years of devotion could be erased by the cruelty of one moment. She stood still in the doorway, the hum of cicadas louder than his footsteps retreating. And I must ask you, dear listener, what would you do if, after giving decades of your love, your loyalty, and your youth, someone told you that your age made you worthless? Would you shatter under the weight of those words, or would you rise, knowing that age is not the end but the crown of your story? Before we go further, if this already strikes a chord in you, don't just watch quietly. Hit the like, subscribe, and most importantly, the new hype button. It's YouTube's way of lifting senior voices above the noise. You can hype 3 videos a week, and every single one helps stories like this reach someone who needs to remember, after 60, our lives don't fade. They deepen. She was born in the heart of small-town Texas in the mid-1950s, a place where the days began before the sun and ended long after it disappeared behind fields of tall grass. Her childhood wasn't one of extravagance, it was made of calloused hands and mornings that smelled of hay and dust. Ranch chores weren't optional, they were part of life, and she learned early on that responsibility came before comfort. Feeding animals before breakfast, hauling buckets of water when her arms were barely strong enough, and listening to the creak of the windmill turning as the day began, these were her lessons in endurance. While other children dreamed of city lights, she found meaning in quiet resilience, in knowing that her worth wasn't in what she wore but in how hard she worked. By the time she was a teenager, she had already mastered more than most adults. She knew how to stretch $1 until it almost tore. She knew how to sit quietly in church pews, hands folded, while thinking about all the chores waiting at home. But she also knew laughter, nights on the porch with her siblings, radio music drifting from the kitchen window, and the comfort of knowing that even if life was hard, family bound it together. It was in those years that she learned how to hold on tightly to people, because things could slip away so easily. She married young, not because she was naive, but because love in those days carried a different meaning. It was a promise, not a contract. She and her husband started with very little, a second-hand couch, mismatched dishes, and the kind of faith that believed tomorrow would always be better if they worked hard enough today. Their first home had a rotary phone mounted on the wall. She remembers the sound of the dial clicking back as she spun it to call her parents, her voice carrying through the heavy receiver as she updated them on her growing family. When her husband had to travel for work, she wrote him letters by hand, folding them carefully and pressing her name at the bottom with a flourish of pride. She told him about the children, about the way their daughter's curls bounced when she laughed, about how their son had learned to run across the yard without stumbling. These letters weren't just words, they were anchors, reminders that even while apart, their bond held them steady. She kept the responses he sent in a tin box, every crease of the paper worn soft from being opened again and again on lonely nights. Raising children in Texas during the 1970s and 80s was no small task. She knew the rhythm of Friday night football games, the excitement buzzing through the small town as families crowded the bleachers. She remembers sitting with other mothers, clutching hot chocolate in styrofoam cups, her children cheering for the team even if they barely understood the rules. Those nights weren't just about football, they were about community, about a town coming alive under the stadium lights, about children learning pride and tradition from the echoes of cheers that carried across the fields. Her life was pieced together through sacrifice. She worked part-time jobs wherever she could find them, sometimes behind the counter at the local diner, sometimes cleaning houses, sometimes sorting produce at the market. The money was never enough, but she stretched it with grit and ingenuity. Coupons became lifelines, leftovers became tomorrow's meals, and every dollar saved was a small victory. Bills piled up, and while her husband struggled with work, she kept the family afloat by balancing what came in against what needed to go out. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival, and she wore that survival like armor. At the kitchen table, where the wood bore the scars of countless meals and children's homework scratches, she often told her children stories from her own youth. Stories of hard work, of her mother's patience, of the times when one storm could wipe out the year's crops but the family would start over again anyway. Her children would lean close, listening, absorbing the lesson hidden beneath every tale, that love meant sacrifice, and sacrifice was the soil from which family grew strong. And this is how you should picture her, not as a woman discarded with age, but as someone who carried a lifetime of perseverance. Imagine sitting across from her now, a cup of coffee warming your hands, hearing her voice tremble slightly as she recalls the milestones of her life. The details don't just tell a story, they create a world, one where she built brick by brick, meal by meal, sacrifice by sacrifice. You can almost see the handwritten letters still folded neatly, the rotary phone mounted like an artifact of another era, the Friday night lights glowing faintly in memory. It is in this setting that her betrayal later unfolds. But before that darkness comes, the light of her history matters. Because only when you know the weight of what someone has carried can you truly understand the depth of what it means when those sacrifices are dismissed. She isn't simply a woman in her 70s from Texas. She is a living archive of endurance, a keeper of family traditions, and a testimony to what it means to hold on when life tries to pull everything away. And sitting with her, even now, feels less like listening to a stranger and more like reconnecting with someone you've known all your life. The house itself told its own story before anyone inside ever spoke. The wooden porch groaned under every step, not from neglect, but from years of living. Generations had crossed those planks, children with bare feet in the summer, guests stopping by after church, neighbors dropping in with pies still warm from the oven. The boards carried the weight of birthdays, arguments, reconciliations, and quiet evenings when she sat alone, listening to the hum of crickets. Inside, the hallway was lined with photo frames, school pictures in mismatched frames, wedding photos that had begun to fade at the edges, a few black and white portraits of grandparents staring sternly as if reminding everyone of the sacrifices that had built this home. The kitchen always smelled of biscuits and coffee, no matter the hour. Even in the hardest seasons, there was always a pot brewing, a comfort she never allowed to run dry. It wasn't just about taste, it was about creating a center, a ritual of warmth that told every visitor, "You are welcome here." The town beyond the porch was stitched together by habits as familiar as breath. On Sundays, the church bells rang clear across the fields, their sound carrying over rooftops and through the open windows of houses where families were still tying children's shoes or straightening collars. Neighbors waved from across fences, their greeting simple but meaningful. A hand lifted in acknowledgement carried weight, it meant you belonged, you were seen. The rhythm of life was unhurried but heavy with tradition. Grocery clerks knew names, teachers remembered parents, and a trip into town wasn't just about errands, it was about conversation. In a place like this, secrets were hard to keep, but endurance was expected. Women especially carried burdens quietly. They kept their voices soft in public, even when their backs bent under responsibility. That was the culture, dignity in silence, respect in sacrifice, survival without spectacle. The atmosphere wasn't just physical, it was generational. Radios in kitchens played country songs that spoke of heartbreak and hard work. Children ran barefoot across fields, chasing fireflies in the warm night air. Old men gathered at the feed store, swapping stories that were more memory than truth, and no one corrected them because storytelling itself was heritage. Families weren't measured by wealth but by how much they showed up, at church suppers, at funerals, at Friday football games. In such a world, your reputation was your lifeline, and one broken promise could ripple through the entire community. It is here, against this backdrop, that her life unfolded. The house wasn't just walls, it was testimony. Every nail, every squeak of the floorboards carried the sound of years invested. And yet, in the same breath, it was also fragile, because homes are not immune to betrayal. They can be broken not by storms or termites, but by words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. Back then, she reflects, houses weren't just walls. They were built with trust, sealed with handshakes, and broken by betrayal. Her words are not metaphor alone, they are memory. In her world, trust was once the mortar that held families together. A neighbor could co-sign a loan, confident it would be repaid. A wife could believe her sacrifices would be honored in the autumn of her years. But betrayal is a silent storm, and when it comes, it doesn't just shake the house, it unsettles the entire ground beneath it. This setting, this home and this town, matters deeply. Because it wasn't just the place where betrayal struck, it was the stage that made the betrayal heavier. A woman who had upheld every tradition, who had lived by the quiet strength her town revered, suddenly faced the fracture of that unspoken agreement. To understand her heartbreak, you must first understand the world she preserved, the one she thought would preserve her in return. The wooden porch, the coffee-filled kitchen, the waving neighbors, the church bells, these were more than details. They were her foundation. And when that foundation cracked, it wasn't just a marriage ending. It was a world unraveling. The moment replayed itself in her mind like a broken record. His voice, sharp and deliberate, "You're too old for me now." There was no hesitation, no stumble over words, just the blunt cruelty of a man who had already rehearsed his exit. On the floor by the door sat her suitcase, not carefully packed but thrown together, one zipper broken, a sleeve of her sweater sticking out like a tongue mocking her. She looked at it the way you look at a stranger who suddenly carries your whole past on their shoulders. This was the same suitcase she had once used when they honeymooned in Galveston, the same one she filled with baby clothes when they visited his mother years ago. Now it was no longer a vessel of beginnings but an emblem of dismissal. She stood there, silent, while he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed as if daring her to protest. But no words came. Sometimes the deepest wounds arrive not with screams but with quiet acceptance, because the fight has already been worn out of you over years. She didn't leave town right away. Instead, she found herself checking into a small motel off the highway, the kind of place where neon lights flickered half the night and the walls smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. The room was sparse, a bed that sagged in the middle, a television with only a few working channels, and a table just big enough for a single lamp and her coffee mug. For the first time in decades, meals became solitary. Dinner might be a can of soup heated in the microwave, eaten while the hum of 18-wheelers drifted through the thin curtains. Loneliness crept in quickly, sharper than hunger. She caught herself listening for footsteps in the hall, for a familiar voice calling her name, but there was nothing, just the buzzing air conditioner straining against the Texas heat. Nights were the hardest. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how a life built over decades could be reduced to a rented room with peeling wallpaper. And yet, in that silence, a small ember of resilience flickered. She was alone, but she was also free of his scorn. The motel's dim light reminded her of another season of hardship, years earlier, when he had lost his job at the plant. Back then, she hadn't hesitated. She picked up double shifts at the diner, scrubbing plates until her hands were raw, balancing trays heavier than her own frame should have carried. She remembered coming home past midnight, slipping off shoes so as not to wake the children, and counting tips on the kitchen table by lamplight. Every dollar mattered. She stretched those wages into rent, groceries, and gas, all while keeping the children clothed and their school fees paid. He had been broken then, embarrassed by his unemployment, but she had stood firm, telling him they'd make it through together. She bore the weight quietly, never once reminding him of what she carried on her back. And now, years later, that sacrifice seemed invisible to him, erased by a single phrase, "Too old." Her memory burned with anger, not because she regretted helping him, but because he had rewritten the story as though her devotion had never existed. One evening, sitting in the motel with her coffee turning cold, she made the mistake of opening her phone. There it was, photos of him, smiling broadly, arms slung around a woman half her age. The caption read like a cruel joke, "Freedom at last." Around him, friends cheered, glasses raised high. It was a freedom party, as though discarding her had been his ticket to joy. She studied the images, not with tears, but with a hollow stillness. How quickly love had been turned into entertainment, how easily sacrifice was replaced by spectacle. She noticed small details, the shirt he wore, one she had once bought for him during better times, the venue, a restaurant she had cleaned tables in long ago to pay their bills. The irony twisted in her chest. This wasn't just betrayal, it was betrayal celebrated, public and shameless. For the first time, her loneliness gave way to clarity. She realized he had not only left her behind but also mocked the very foundation she had built for him. And yet, within that sting, something else stirred. His freedom looked shallow, loud, and fleeting. Hers, though painful, had the chance to be real. In the motel's quiet, she whispered to herself, "I was never the burden. I was the builder. And if he thinks age makes me worthless, then he never understood the strength it took to carry us this far." Each stage of conflict, insult, exile, memory, betrayal, was not just a breaking. It was also a revelation, one that reshaped her understanding of worth and dignity. Her earliest memory of struggle was not in her marriage but in her childhood, long before she knew what promises and betrayals even meant. She grew up under the watchful eyes of strict parents who believed that discipline built character. The days began before sunrise, with her father's voice calling her to feed the animals or sweep the porch before school. Her mother expected her to carry herself with dignity, to never complain even when her hands ached from scrubbing or when her back burned from bending over the garden rows. She remembered the sound of the wooden screen door slamming shut, the smell of cornbread baking, the silence at the dinner table when her father was displeased. From them she learned resilience, not as a lofty word, but as a muscle developed through repetition, through every task finished without complaint, every hardship met with quiet endurance. That kind of childhood forged in her a spine of steel hidden beneath a soft voice. It would serve her later in life, though it would also be the very quality others took advantage of. Years later, she would call upon that resilience in her role as a mother. She remembered vividly the first night she held her newborn daughter in her arms. The hospital room was dim, the hum of machines low in the background, her husband absent because work had called him away. She pressed the baby close, studying the tiny fingers curled around her own, and whispered promises into the soft skin of her child's cheek. In that moment, exhaustion mingled with awe, and she realized motherhood was not a duty but a covenant. While her husband pursued stability outside, she bore the weight of nurturing inside. She became the night watch, the morning light, the one who rocked fevers into submission and calmed nightmares with lullabies. When her husband came home, he saw only the child sleeping peacefully. He did not see the hours of pacing floors, the quiet sacrifices of her own body and mind. Yet she did not resent him then. Love made the silence bearable, and faith made the sacrifice sacred. There were, however, hidden sacrifices that went unspoken, even to him. She remembered the time medical bills piled up after his accident. The envelopes arrived with red stamps, warnings of overdue balances. He sat at the table, shoulders slumped, shame etched into his features. She never told him that she had been quietly saving money in a jar tucked behind the flour sacks in the pantry, small amounts skimmed from her grocery budget, coins collected from odd jobs. She took that money and paid the bills without a word, handing the receipts to him as though they had come from nowhere. He thanked her, relief flooding his face, and she only nodded, never revealing the months of sacrifice it had taken. Her pride was not in being recognized but in keeping the family afloat. That was her way, to shield him from the storm, to hold the weight without demanding acknowledgement. But memory has a way of sharpening over time, and now she recalled it with a pang. What had been invisible then was forgotten entirely now, erased as if it had never happened. In the present, she sat with these memories crowding around her like ghosts, each one speaking louder than his insult. Now he calls me a burden, she thought, but I was the scaffolding he stood on. The image was clear in her mind. He had been able to climb, to build, to present himself strong only because she had been the frame holding steady beneath him. Scaffolding isn't glamorous, it is hidden behind the facade, taken down once the work is done, rarely acknowledged in photographs. Yet without it, the structure never stands. She realized her life had been just that, a silent support, a necessary presence dismissed when the surface seemed complete. These flashbacks wove themselves into her present like threads, not weakening her but reminding her of her true strength. Her parents' strictness had forged resilience. Her daughter's birth had revealed the depth of her love. Her secret savings had proven her ingenuity and selflessness. And now, in the quiet of her new reality, she understood something profound. The years others tried to erase were the very years that defined her worth. She was not a burden. She was the foundation, the unseen but unshakable force that had carried an entire family forward. And while betrayal might have tried to silence her, memory restored her dignity, one flashback at a time. She knew where the levers of power in the marriage had always been, and though she had rarely pulled them, she was the one who had managed the accounts, balanced the checkbooks, and kept the financial wheels turning. When he dismissed her, assuming she would simply disappear with her suitcase, he forgot that she had been the one keeping his chaos from collapsing. Quietly, deliberately, she cut his access to accounts she had long overseen. The passwords were changed, the signatures revoked. For the first time in years, he had to face the reality of his spending without her invisible corrections smoothing the edges. The man who thought she was too old discovered just how fragile his freedom was when stripped of the scaffolding she provided. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The bills he had ignored, the debts he had accumulated, the reckless purchases he made in his rush to prove himself young again, all of them came due. The foreclosure notice arrived in a thin envelope that carried more weight than any insult he had ever thrown. He stood in the same house where she had once stretched every dollar, where she had kept the lights on with late-night shifts and sacrifice, and now it slipped through his hands because he no longer had her to steady it. Neighbors who once envied the laughter at his freedom party now whispered about his downfall. What had seemed like independence revealed itself as irresponsibility, a truth she had long known but kept hidden behind her quiet corrections. The courtroom was the final stage, and she sat there silently, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Her presence was calm, almost regal, as lawyers read out the details of his misdeeds. The tone was heavy, every word echoing in the sterile room. His face, once smug with certainty, now twitched with shame as the list of unpaid debts, reckless transfers, and broken obligations was laid bare for all to hear. She did not need to speak, the truth spoke for her. The years of sacrifice, the decades of quiet support, were suddenly illuminated by the absence of her hand. What he had dismissed as burden was revealed to have been lifeline. The audience, even those who did not know the full history, held their breath at the weight of the revelations. This was not a climax of shouting or dramatic gestures, it was a slow tightening, a sequence of consequences closing in like a vice. His freedom, so loudly celebrated, shrank with each revelation. Her silence was not passive, it was powerful. It was the silence of someone who had already spoken through her life, through her sacrifices, through her endurance. Watching him unravel, she felt no triumph, only clarity. The scaffolding she had once provided was gone, and without it, he collapsed under the weight of his own choices. What had been framed as her weakness was unmasked as his dependence. The arc was complete, not in an explosion, but in a steady, undeniable collapse that left no doubt about where true strength had always resided. The chipped cup sat on the table, porcelain worn thin by years of use, its crack running like a scar along the side. She filled it with tea, steam curling into the quiet air of her new space. There was no grandeur, no polished china, just this small vessel that had survived countless mornings, countless storms, and now carried a new kind of peace. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth that seeped into her palms. For the first time in decades, the tea was not hurried, not gulped between chores or arguments or obligations. It was hers, a ritual of calm that did not need to prove itself to anyone. The cup, like her, bore its imperfections openly, and in those cracks lay its beauty. Every sip was a reminder that survival itself is dignity, and peace does not need to be perfect to be real. Later that week, her grandson came to visit. The driveway of her small rented place became their canvas, a box of chalk spread open between them. He crouched down, tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, as he sketched uneven shapes and bold stick figures. She joined him, her hands leaving streaks of pink and yellow blossoms across the pavement. The flowers bloomed under their fingertips, crude but joyful, each line alive with laughter. The boy's giggles echoed in the open air, and she laughed with him, not the polite laugh she had once carried at dinner tables, but a full, unrestrained sound that rolled from her chest. In those moments, she was not abandoned, not erased, not dismissed. She was simply a grandmother, present and whole, passing down something far greater than money or houses: time, attention, love. The chalk dust clung to her skin, and she welcomed it, a badge of joy. The colors would wash away with the rain, but the memory, like the cracks in her cup, would remain. And then came the day she found herself standing across the street from the house she once called home. The auction sign stood planted in the yard, its bold letters announcing the end of what she had built. She did not cry. There were no tears left for those walls, no sorrow for the windows she had once washed or the floors she had once scrubbed. She watched with a quiet detachment, a witness to the truth that homes can be lost, but the essence of a life cannot be sold. The neighbors passed by with glances, some whispering, some pretending not to notice. She stood steady, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the sign not as a symbol of loss, but of release. The house had been taken, yes, but so had the weight she carried inside it. For the first time, she did not feel bound by its walls. She felt light, untethered, free. The resolution was not in triumph but in stillness. She did not win a battle in the way stories often promise. What she gained was quieter, deeper. The chipped cup, the chalk flowers, the auction sign, they were markers of transformation. Each moment lingered with a lesson, that peace is not found in grand gestures, but in small acts of presence. That joy can be rediscovered not in what you hold on to, but in what you let go of. And that freedom sometimes arrives not as victory, but as release. She carried these truths with her, not loudly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has endured, who has rebuilt herself in the silence of ordinary days. In that stillness, she discovered something he had never known, that the end of one home could be the beginning of a truer one, built not with walls, but with resilience, memory, and unshakable dignity. There are truths we often carry quietly, truths that shape our lives but rarely find words. One of them is that silence has a hidden cost. For years, she endured without complaint, thinking that love meant covering every wound, every failure, with her own strength. But silence, while noble in intent, can also erase you from the story you helped build. When you do not speak your worth, others may forget it exists. And so her silence, which once held her family together, became the very tool used to dismiss her. That is a cost too high for anyone to bear. Another truth is that sacrifice should never be rewritten as burden. Too often, the things done out of love, the nights spent working when exhausted, the meals skipped so children could eat, the savings given in secret to cover another's mistakes, these acts vanish in memory. Worse still, they can be twisted into weakness, as though giving was a flaw instead of the foundation of survival. But sacrifice is not burden. Sacrifice is evidence of devotion, and when someone rewrites it otherwise, it says more about their blindness than about your worth. Then there is the truth about letting go. Dignity is not always found in clinging or fighting to the bitter end. Sometimes it is found in release, in choosing not to crumble when the house is lost, in sipping tea from a chipped cup with pride, in drawing flowers with a child and knowing that joy lives outside material walls. Letting go is not failure. It is freedom, a reclaiming of self after years of carrying too much. And in that act of release, there is a quiet dignity no insult can erase. Finally, truth has its own power. It does not need applause, recognition, or even acknowledgement to exist. When she sat in the courtroom, silent while his misdeeds were revealed, she did not argue or plead. The truth stood on its own, undeniable. That is its power. It outlasts lies, it survives betrayal, and it reveals itself even when buried under years of neglect. Applause may fade, but truth remains. So I ask you now, have you ever been erased from a story you helped build? Have you poured yourself into something, into someone, only to find your part forgotten when the tale was retold? And what sacrifice in your life still waits for acknowledgement? What hidden act of love, what quiet endurance, deserves to be spoken out loud, even if only to yourself? This is Life After 60 Stories. If this story touched you, don't just hype it so YouTube knows our voices matter. Share it with a friend who needs to know that dignity doesn't fade with age. And subscribe, because after 60, our stories don't end. They finally get told.